In the stillness of the night, when the waters echo only the sighs of time, there lies a city that once stood at the pinnacle of glory before being forgotten beneath the waves. Venice, the empire that turned mud into treasure and the sea into its throne. Long before it became a paradise for travelers and the gleaming face of postcards, this place was a silent empire, where power, intrigue, and genius intertwined like the labyrinth of canals that crisscross its heart. In this video, you will not only hear the history of Venice, but also feel its soul. A Venice untouched by the flash of cameras or the footsteps of tourists, where craftsmen, merchants, and explorers built miracles upon the water's edge. Let this story guide you back to a time when that forgotten empire still lived, breathed, and shone, in ways the modern world has never truly understood. As the light of the prologue slowly fades, the waters of the Adriatic emerge like an ancient mirror, reflecting the silhouettes of Venice's first inhabitants, not proud nobles or wealthy merchants, but refugees, lost souls fleeing the relentless storms of history. And from that moment of despair, a legend began to take shape. Venice, the child born from mud and fear, yet raised by resilience and an extraordinary will to live. In the 5th century AD, the Italian peninsula was in chaos. The Roman Empire, once the symbol of order and power, was collapsing, while the Huns and Goths from the north swept down, burning every city in their path. Ordinary people, unarmed and defenseless, had no refuge left but the marshlands along the Adriatic coast, a land so desolate that even the invaders saw no reason to enter. They waded through the dark, heavy mud, carrying fragments of their former lives. A wooden cross, a small knife, a fragile faith that perhaps this land of water and reeds, might yet save them from extinction. No one could have imagined that in this unforgiving place, a wondrous civilization would one day rise, not on land, but on water. The first Venetians accomplished what seemed impossible. They drove wooden piles deep into the clay beneath the mud, creating artificial foundations strong enough to support homes and temples. Every beam, every plank was a fusion of courage and creativity. Proof that human beings could adapt even to the impossible. With no soil to till, they learned to harvest the sea. With no stone to build, they used the strength of water itself to resist its own power. From those fragile huts balancing above the marsh, Venice gradually became a network of canals, where people and water merged into one living body. The canals were not merely paths of travel. They were veins carrying breath, life, and rhythm to the entire city. At dawn, sunlight shimmered on the water's surface like 1,000 tiny mirrors, while the slow, steady sound of oars echoed through the air, the heartbeat of a city learning to rise from the mud. But what truly set Venice apart was not just the ingenuity of its architecture or the skill of its craftsmen. It was its spirit, a will to survive so fierce that it turned fear into strength, fragility into power. The Venetians knew they could not rely on the mainland, nor on kings or empires. Isolation taught them self-reliance. The sea became their friend, their mother, their teacher. Out of hardship, a national character began to take shape, resilient, pragmatic, and refined. They understood that power did not always come from the sword, but from trade, from shrewd calculation, from the art of adaptation. These were the first seeds of what would later become the Republic of Merchants, a political system unlike any other, one that would define the very soul of Venice. Yet, in those early days, when the city still had no name, the Venetians did not think of power. They thought only of survival, that each sunrise meant they were still alive. And for them, that was victory enough. Imagine it. Amid the salty mist hanging over the lagoon, wooden roofs clustered close together, children played on narrow bridges, women dried their nets, and men sailed far out to fish, returning with their catch and stories from the open sea. Bit by bit, they turned their refuge into a home, their fear into pride. But Venice was not built merely of wood and stone. It was built from shared memory, memories of the days of flight, of nights when mud reached their knees, of the belief that only unity could keep them alive. The first settlers knew that if one pile broke, the whole house would collapse. If one canal clogged, the entire neighborhood would sink. Thus, Venice became a symbol of connection, of individuals blending into a single community. a spirit that would later shape their governance, trade, and art. From the cold mud, they built not only houses but a philosophy of life. If the world rejects us, we will create our own. A world where the sea was no longer a threat, but a path to salvation. And then, as if by miracle, from the desolate marsh rose ever larger buildings and ever stronger ships. The waters that once hid them from enemies became the very routes that led them to every port across the Mediterranean. Those once mocked as mud dwellers became masters of the sea. This rise was not loud or glorious like other conquests. It was quiet, steady, like the way water shapes stone over centuries. Venice did not erupt. It seeped, it spread, and in time it enveloped the ancient world of commerce. Looking back, we see that the history of Venice is a living testament to one of nature's strangest laws. The weak can overcome the strong, if they learn to turn weakness into strength. Water, once the emblem of uncertainty, became their weapon. Mud, once a devourer of all things, became the foundation of a city that has endured for 1,000 years. Perhaps it is because they were born in adversity that the Venetians carry within them a fragile yet proud beauty. They belong neither to the land nor entirely to the sea. They exist in the space between two worlds, half real, half dream. That is what gives Venice its poetic aura. Every story about this city tastes faintly of myth, yet is steeped in the sweat and tears of real people. When we gaze upon Venice today, with its palaces reflected upon tranquil waters, it is easy to forget that it all began in foul-smelling swamps and with frightened souls. But it is precisely in those lowest places that humanity often rediscovers its dignity. And that is what makes Venice truly great. There would be no Venice of tourists, of glittering lights, of gondoliers serenading under the moon, if there had not first been the Venice of mud, of despair, and of the will to survive. And that is why, when we tell the story of Venice, we are not merely telling the story of a city, but of humankind itself. The story of how we conquer fear to create beauty. From here, the tale continues, as those who once lived among the marshes came to realize that survival required more than shelter. They needed a system, an order, a government, and from those shaky wooden homes, a political structure, unlike any in human history, began to form. Where power did not rest in the hands of kings, but in those of men who could count coin, read the wind, and listen to the breathing of the sea. But that is a story for the next chapter. The unique political system, the Republic of Merchants. From mud and despair, Venice rose upon the waters. Those who had once clung only to survival now began to look farther ahead. They realized that if their city was to not only exist, but endure, it needed something stronger than the wooden piles beneath their feet. A system, an order, a shared soul to keep Venice from being swept away. And so, amid the deep green canals, a political experiment unlike anything Europe had ever seen was born. The Republic of Merchants. Venice had no king, no throne, no queen, no glittering court like Florence or Milan. What they had was a single leader elected for life, the Doge, and behind him, a complex, almost mathematical network of power where everything was balanced between ambition, suspicion, and loyalty. Venice understood better than anyone that absolute power leads to ruin. They had watched the Roman Empire collapse for that very reason. Thus, they built a system where no one could rule alone, and no one could betray the collective without being discovered. In the Venetian Republic, the Doge was not a monarch. He was a symbol, a light that could shine, but never burn. Upon election, he swore before all to act never for personal gain. When signing a decree, he could not do it alone. At least 2 witnesses were required. When meeting foreign envoys, his every word was recorded. In truth, the Doge lived as a prisoner of his own throne, revered, but watched at every breath. Behind the Doge stood the Great Council, the true seat of power, made up of the city's wealthiest merchant families. They were not nobles by blood, but nobles of intellect and enterprise. The very people who had built Venice with their gold, sweat, and cunning. Together, they forged a political system without precedent, one where merchants ruled, where economic interest was the foundation of law, and where stability was valued above freedom. To govern a city built entirely upon water, the Venetians had to master balance, and they applied that principle to politics as rigorously as to architecture. Power was divided like the city's canals, each current flowing its own course, yet all converging into the same sea, the sea of collective interest. If the Great Council was the spine, then the Council of Ten was the heart, a secret body charged with guarding the Republic's safety. Operating in the shadows, silent yet relentless, these 10 men hunted down conspiracies, spies, and corruption. They were not merely a political institution. They were Venice's immune system. Venice had discovered how to sustain power without violence. No vast prisons, no public executions. Yet everyone knew that betrayal meant disappearance, quiet and absolute, as though one had never existed. And strangely enough, it was fear that created stability. Mutual suspicion became the glue that bound society together, forcing everyone to act carefully, loyally, pragmatically. Venice endured for nearly 1,000 years, not because of mercy, but because of cold, calculated precision. Yet within this rigid control, Venice still radiated a different kind of freedom, the freedom of trade, of creativity, of thought. When power was shared, no one was strong enough to dominate, and no one was weak enough to be crushed. The city became a flawless machine, each person a cog turning with purpose. Within this order, commerce blossomed like sails catching wind. Venice traded not only in goods, but in information, culture, and influence. Every merchant was at once a diplomat, a spy, and a guardian of state secrets. The entire city functioned like a living organism, each vein carrying the flow of gold and salt, silk and spice, treaties inked with trust and ambition. No one loved their city as deeply as the Venetians. But theirs was not blind patriotism. It was the devotion of those who knew that if Venice fell, all would be lost. They were loyal not out of faith, but out of reason. And it was that reason that made Venice one of the most stable powers in history. Not through charisma, not through religion, but through a social structure as precise as an ancient clock. If Florence lived by art and Rome by faith, then Venice lived by calculation. It was a city of people who measured profit by the grain, read the winds like scripture, and studied the tides of time. Every decision was debated, every policy weighed for its collective benefit. There was no room for whim or emotion, only logic and strategy. But do not mistake Venice for cold or soulless. Beneath the masks of restraint burned an unshakable desire to control destiny. While the rest of Europe believed that power was a gift from God, Venice proved that power was a creation of humankind, of intelligence, organization, and law. That made them heretics in the medieval world, a nation of reason, adrift in a sea of superstition. In the palaces lining the Grand Canal, beneath gilded ceilings and marble walls, Venice's true power was not stored in swords, but in ledgers. Their accounting books were maps of empire, every number marking an alliance, a voyage, a treaty woven from gold and ink. A wealthy Venetian needed no crown. Control of a harbour was his throne, and in this city, every road led to the sea, where each coin sent forth returned multiplied, carried home on ships heavy with goods and stories. For nearly a millennium, the Republic of Venice was not just a state, it was a philosophy of life. Let no man rule over all, let all rule over one. That principle shielded Venice from countless civil wars, uprisings, and collapses that consumed its neighbours. While Europe shifted from monarchy to feudalism to theocracy, Venice stood unchanged, silent, proud, enduring. From afar, Venice seemed like a mirror reflecting humanity, both noble and treacherous, wise and cold. Yet within that contradiction, it found perfect balance, and perhaps that is why, long after other powers crumbled, Venice remains vivid in the memory of humankind, not merely as a city of art, but as a symbol of political genius and human clarity. When the waters of the Grand Canal fall still beneath the sunset, one might imagine the spirits of the old doges still watching over their city, not through dominance, but through discipline, law, and foresight. And as this chapter of politics draws to a close, Venice stands at the threshold of a new age, where power no longer rests behind stone walls, but stretches out over the sea. For once, the Venetians had built a stable system of rule. They knew it was time, not merely to master their city, but to master the world. And thus begins the next chapter, from Byzantium's vassal to an independent maritime empire. When the foundations of political stability had been firmly laid, Venice stood like a ship with her hull complete, ready to set sail. After centuries of learning how to live with the sea, the Venetians began to learn how to master it. But to become a true maritime power, Venice first had to confront a towering shadow that still loomed over the east, the Byzantine Empire, their teacher, their protector, and ultimately, the rival they would surpass to become the strongest independent trading empire in Europe. In her earliest centuries, Venice was no free power. She was a small vassal state of Byzantium, surviving on the grace and decrees of Constantinople, that radiant eastern capital where gold, incense, and sacred ritual wove together into a single, shimmering tapestry. Venice in those days was the obedient child, bowing, paying tribute, and serving faithfully. But this child was never meant to remain submissive. From Byzantium, the Venetians absorbed the most refined of lessons: how to trade, how to govern, and above all, how to blend faith with power. From their imperial masters, they learned that commerce was more than mere exchange. It was politics disguised in sales and ledgers. At first, Venice was only a gateway, a stopover for goods flowing between east and west. Yet over time, they discovered a profound truth. The middleman controls everything. They did not need to conquer or wear a crown. To rule the seas, all they had to do was command the routes that carried the world's riches. And by seizing those routes, they grasped the economic lifeblood of the Mediterranean. The turning point came in 1082, when Emperor Alexios I Komnenos of Byzantium issued the Golden Bull, a document that seemed a generous gift, but was in truth a fateful mistake. That decree granted Venetian merchants tax exemptions across the empire, the right to establish trade quarters, and free access to harbours and warehouses without restriction. Byzantium believed it was buying loyalty, yet it had unknowingly handed Venice the keys to independence. From that moment, the balance of power began to shift. Venice, once the obedient child, now dealt with the emperor as an equal. They swiftly conquered the sea lanes, establishing trading posts in Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople itself. Every ship bearing the winged lion of St. Mark that left port was like an arrow piercing deeper into the heart of the Byzantine economy. The Venetians did not need war to conquer. They used commerce as a weapon. Their gold seeped into every corner of the old empire, buying off officials, manipulating prices, and gradually transforming Byzantium into a debtor on its own seas. And when the perfect opportunity arrived, Venice struck, cloaked in the holy name of faith, the Fourth Crusade. It was the year 1202. Europe burned with zeal to liberate the Holy Land. Kings and knights of the West signed contracts with Venice, hiring their ships to transport crusaders across the Mediterranean. But Venice, ever calculating, saw that a holy war could also be a profitable one. Instead of carrying the army to Jerusalem, the blind but brilliant Doge Enrico Dandolo redirected the fleet toward Constantinople, their former ally. The crusade became a grand act of plunder. Constantinople, the city of God, was ravaged without mercy. Libraries burned, churches were looted, holy statues were torn apart for gold. And amid that chaos, the Venetians quietly gathered their true prizes: ports, islands, and complete independence. Venice took more than treasures. They took the soul of Byzantium, its art, its architecture, its symbols, as if the apprentice had absorbed all the master's genius before walking away to forge his own dynasty. After 1204, Venice emerged as the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean. They seized Crete, Corfu, Euboea, and Rhodes, glittering pearls scattered across the sea lanes, forming what contemporaries called the necklace of the sea. Each island became a link in their vast maritime chain, a trading hub, a fortress, a heartbeat in the great commercial body that stretched from Italy to the Black Sea. No other power of the age could rival the precision of Venice's system. They controlled supply, dictated prices, and even influenced the policies of neighboring states. They did not need to proclaim themselves an empire. They already were one, an empire of wind, salt, gold, and contracts. The Venetians understood that true power lay not in the sword, but in the balance of trade. They bought peace with profit, bought enemies with deals, and when necessary, they even bought victory itself. This was the art of Venice, the art of turning everything into commerce. Even war and faith, from this point onward, Venice ceased to be a floating refuge of exiles. She became the capital of a maritime empire. Her ships, bearing the banner of St. Mark, carried not just goods but laws, culture, and political influence. In every harbour of the Mediterranean, the echo of Venice could be heard, not through weapons, but through the invisible power of trade. Yet perhaps Venice's greatest strength lay not in her triumphs, but in her wisdom in defeat. After the conquest of Constantinople, she resisted the imperial delusion that had ruined so many before. Venice knew that power was never eternal. Only profit and reputation could endure. So instead of erecting monuments or expanding through bloodshed, they fortified their empire through commerce, law, and a deliberately calculated neutrality. Venice understood that to survive the storm, one must always remain at the centre. They leaned neither toward the Pope nor toward the Emperor. They were the brokers of the medieval world, bridging East and West, Christendom and Islam, wealth and poverty. They traded with everyone, but were loyal to no one, and because of that, Venice became the beating heart of the Mediterranean, the place where all currents met: goods, money, knowledge, and culture. If Byzantium had once been the beacon of the East, then Venice had become the lantern of a new world, one where currency replaced faith, and commerce became a weapon stronger than any crusade. The Venetians never looked back with gratitude or guilt. Their gaze was always forward, toward the distant horizons, where their ships would carry the name of their city to Egypt, India, and even China. They had learned everything from Byzantium, and now it was time for the master to step aside. As the sun set over the Grand Canal, its crimson light glinting off gilded domes, Venice knew she was no longer anyone's vassal. She had rewritten the law of the sea, and now the sea belonged to her. And as a symbol of this new power, Venice would soon claim for herself a sacred guardian, St. Mark, whose relics they would steal from Alexandria, transforming him into the spiritual heart of their empire. The next chapter tells of that very moment, when the symbol of power was born, and Venice stepped into her golden age. The symbol of power, St. Mark and the arsenal. When the commercial empire had finally taken form, and ships bearing the winged lion of Venice began to dominate the Mediterranean, the Venetians understood a timeless truth. An empire needs not only power, but a soul. They already possessed gold, influence, and a web of trade that reached across the known world. Yet one thing was missing: a sacred symbol, a spiritual banner that could make every Venetian believe their prosperity was not born of chance, but ordained by God himself. And so, on a daring voyage, Venice found its soul, St. Mark, the saint whose name, pride, and destiny would forever be bound to the city upon the sea. The story begins in the 9th century, when two Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, were given a perilous mission to steal the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria, Egypt, a Muslim land where removing a holy body was an act of sacrilege. But the Venetians had never feared sacrilege, not when it could bring them power. They hid the saint's body in a barrel of pork, a clever disguise since Muslims would never touch it. Then, under the cover of secrecy, they sailed across the waves, carrying not just a relic, but the destiny of a nation. When their ship finally reached Venice, the city erupted in joy. Citizens flooded the canals, church bells thundered, and the Doge himself came forth to receive the saint as if welcoming salvation. From that moment, Venice was no longer merely a city, it became the city of St. Mark. St. Mark was not just a religious figure, he was a political declaration, a divine manifesto that said, "We belong neither to Byzantium nor to the Pope. We have a God of our own." Upon the ruins of a small church, Venice built the Basilica di San Marco, one of the most magnificent masterpieces of medieval Europe. Every brick, every mosaic shimmered with the eternal ambition of Venice, to be remembered not merely as wealthy, but as chosen. Inside, the golden mosaics gleamed under the filtered light, illuminating the walls and domes as though heaven itself had melted down to bless the earth. It was more than a sanctuary. It was a statement in gold and stone. Venice was the perfect marriage of faith and pragmatism, of sanctity and profit. For through St. Mark, every act, conquest, exploitation, or expansion could be justified as the will of God. But if St. Mark was the soul of Venice, then the arsenal, her legendary shipyard, was her heart. The Arsenale di Venezia was not merely a workshop, but a symbol of industrial power and collective discipline, unheard of in the medieval world. Built in the 12th century and expanded under successive doges, it became the factory of the world. Thousands of craftsmen, engineers, carpenters, and sailors laboured ceaselessly there. In an age when Europe still built ships by hand over many months, Venice's arsenal could complete a warship in a single day. That was no legend. It was organisation turned into miracle. The Venetians had invented the assembly line centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Timber cutters, frame builders, caulkers, sailmakers, inspectors, each step synchronized in perfect rhythm, like a living machine. If any place in the medieval world deserved to be called a factory, it was the arsenal. Within its walls, the air rang with the sounds of creation, the clang of hammers, the rasp of saws, the hiss of molten metal. Smoke from the forges mingled with the mist of the lagoon, wrapping the docks in a sacred haze. Venice had turned labour into glory, craftsmanship into industry, and through that she became not just a trader, but a creator of a new world. The ships born of the arsenal carried more than cargo. They carried the pride of Venice. Each galea, each war galley, was a work of art, intricately carved, its sails adorned with the winged lion of St. Mark. That emblem struck awe across the seas, from Alexandria to Constantinople, for when that banner appeared on the horizon, every port knew Venice had arrived. It was in the arsenal that Venice built the ships that would shape history, from the galleys that triumphed at Lepanto to the merchant fleets that bridged east and west. Here was born the concept of sea power, the very foundation that later empires like England, the Netherlands, and Portugal would emulate. Without the arsenal, there would be no Venice as we know it, and without St. Mark, that power would lack the soul that made it divine. Venice masterfully united these two symbols, the sacred and the mechanical, faith and labour, to forge an identity unlike any other. They transformed religion into politics and technology into a form of worship. Every craftsman in the arsenal was seen as a servant of St. Mark, and every ship that sailed was an offering to their heavenly patron. When night fell and the moonlight rippled across the lagoon, the arsenal never slept. Torches flickered along the docks, and the songs of workers drifted through the wind. That was Venice alive, Venice breathing, not in grand ceremonies, but in the rhythm of hammers, in the scent of wood and salt, in the pulse of thousands of human hearts. From afar, the Doge could stand upon his palace balcony, watching the glow of the arsenal fires dance across the water, knowing that his empire still moved in perfect harmony. No armies of conquest, no vast lands were needed, only ships and faith. With those, Venice ruled the world through sheer will and imagination. And so, when modern travellers gaze up at the domes of St. Mark's Basilica, they are not merely admiring art, they are reading a manifesto written in gold and iron, where faith and labour became one. St. Mark, with his open gospel in hand, still seems to smile, not at the devotion of his followers, but at the daring of a people who stole a saint to create their own destiny. And though the arsenal now stands as a monument to the past, its echoes still resound, each hammer strike a heartbeat, each ship a hymn to eternal ambition. In their brilliance and audacity, the Venetians achieved what few ever could. They made both God and the machine serve a single ideal, the greatness of humankind. And from that foundation, faith sanctified and power mechanized, Venice began to look farther beyond the horizon, past the Mediterranean, toward new ports and uncharted worlds. A new age of exploration was dawning, an age where Venice would not only rule the seas, but become the bridge between East and West in the era of great discoveries. Up next, we enter the next chapter of that story. The legendary trade routes, the Maritime Silk Road. From the arsenal, where ships were born like steel warriors of an empire, to the Grand Basilica, where St. Mark reigns amid shimmering mosaics of gold, Venice possessed both a heart and a soul. Yet there was still one thing that made this city truly unique, a ritual unlike any other in the world. a ceremony blending power, faith, and symbolism, a sacred union between humankind and the sea. For if the sea had given birth to Venus, the Venetians repaid it with love, with reverence, and with an eternal vow: we marry the sea. Each year, on the Feast of the Ascension, Festa della Senza, when the first summer sunlight glitters upon the Adriatic, Venice reenacts the ancient ritual known as the Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage with the sea. It is not merely a religious rite or a national celebration, it is the very heart of the Venetian Republic, a living symbol of the sacred bond that ties the city to the ocean. The Doge, the head of the Republic, would step aboard the Bucentoro, the most magnificent ceremonial galley in all of Europe, gilded in gold and adorned with angels' carvings, and the winged lion of St. Mark. As the Bucentoro left the quay, thousands of Venetians gathered along the Grand Canal, cheering, casting flowers into the water, and singing ancient hymns of farewell. The surface of the lagoon shimmered like glass, reflecting the proud gazes of an entire people. Out at sea, when the Bucentoro reached the waters off Lido, the Doge would rise, lift a golden ring, and proclaim in a voice that echoed across the waves: Desponsamus te, mare, in signum veri perpetuique domini. We wed thee, O sea, as a sign of our true and everlasting dominion. Then he would cast the ring into the deep blue water, a timeless promise between Venice and the sea. In that moment, silence would fall upon the city. No one spoke. Only the sound of waves kissing the hull remained, the breath of an unspoken love that had endured for over 1,000 years. This ritual held a meaning far deeper than any treaty or alliance. To the Venetians, the sea was not merely a trade route or a source of wealth and power. It was a mother, a lover, and a test of faith. The sea could nurture or it could destroy, and only those who revered it, who listened to its voice, could survive upon it. The marriage with the sea was Venice's way of declaring to the world: we do not possess the sea, we belong to it. In that belief, the Venetians revealed a profound understanding of nature. They knew their smallness amid the boundless waves, yet also that in such humility lay their strength. In a Europe of fiery kings and bloody conquests, Venice chose a different path, the path of tides and winds, where power was born not of conquest, but of harmony. No other ceremony embodied that spirit so completely. The Venetian Republic, a state governed by reason and profit, somehow preserved this poetic and sacred ritual for centuries. They understood that strength cannot endure without symbolism, and the marriage with the sea became the spiritual lifeblood binding the people to their republic, merging faith and pride into one eternal gesture. The Doge was not just a ruler. He was the groom of the ocean, the voice of an entire city pledging loyalty to the waters. The people of Venice, craftsmen, merchants, sailors, were the witnesses of that vow. Each time the Bucentoro sliced through the waves, they felt their own fates woven tighter with the endless blue of the Adriatic. Yet, if one looks deeper, this ritual was not merely about faith. It was a masterpiece of politics disguised as poetry. When the Doge cast his ring into the sea, he was not only speaking to the waters, he was addressing the world, proclaiming that Venice was not a landlocked kingdom, not bound by borders, not subject to pope or emperor. Its power was the power of the waves, uncontainable, immeasurable, and impossible to rule. Each year this ceremony served as a declaration of sovereignty. To their enemies, it said, "Venice cannot be conquered, for its realm is the boundless sea." To its people it whispered, "However rich, however splendid, we are still the children of water and wind." Few rituals in history have combined symbolism and humanity so beautifully. While other kingdoms glorified conquest and blood, Venice celebrated harmony and reverence. The sea was never a subject to be ruled, it was a companion to be loved. And perhaps that is why Venice endured longer than almost any other empire. Imagine the scene, dawn on the shores of Lido, the Bucentoro gliding outward, its oars glinting in the sunlight, hundreds of flags fluttering in the wind. Church bells ring in rhythm with the sailors' songs, echoing across the shimmering water like an ancient symphony. In that moment, time itself seems to pause. The entire city becomes one being, breathing as one, gazing toward the sea, believing that somewhere within those endless waves lies something holier than power or gold. And when the ring falls, that tiny golden circle sinking slowly. Beneath the rippling water, it becomes a fleeting image of eternity, for, like marriage itself, the bond between Venice and the sea rests not only on love, but on challenge, sacrifice, and faith. Centuries have passed, the Republic has fallen, and the Doge exists only in history books. Yet the marriage with the sea continues. Each year, Venetians revive the ceremony, calling back the spirit of their ancestors as if to say, "We are still here. We still belong to the sea, as we always have." And perhaps that is why Venice never truly dies. Though time erodes its stones, though the waters rise and tourists tread its pavements, the city lives on. Because it is not merely a place, but a promise between humanity and nature that refuses to fade. In all of human history, few cities could ever claim to have wed a force of nature, but Venice did. Not only through ritual, but through the very way it exists. Every wooden pile beneath its foundations, every bridge, every red-tiled roof, all stand as testaments to its love and loyalty to the sea. And if anyone were to ask how Venice has survived for more than 1,000 years upon water and time, the answer lies here. Because they loved the sea, not as a resource, but as destiny. When the ceremony ends and night descends, the people of Venice return to their lives. The shipwrights to their docks, the merchants to their vessels, the singers to their songs on the Piazza San Marco. Yet somewhere, within the sound of the waves, one can still hear the echo of that ancient vow. We wed thee, O sea, forever. And from that love, Venice unfurled its sails once more, building a vast archipelago of power, a maritime empire of radiant isles that history would remember as the pearls of the sea. From the sacred ritual of the marriage with the sea, the Venetians did more than declare their love. They signed an eternal pact with the ocean. They understood that the sea was not merely a companion, but the only path that could lead them to prosperity. And from that vow, a mighty maritime empire began to take shape, where each wind-filled sail carried not only goods, but also a dream of ruling the world through trade and refinement. If there were one word to describe Venice at the height of its power, it would be network. A network not woven from silk thread, but from ships, harbours, and treaties. From the Adriatic to Alexandria, from the Dalmatian coast to Crete, Cyprus, and Constantinople, wherever the waves touched land, Venice left its mark. The Venetians called those stops pearls upon the sea, and they, the helmsmen of dreams, were the connecting threads that bound all into a glittering crown across the Mediterranean by the 13th century. Venice was no longer merely a city, it was a true maritime empire. Their merchants appeared in every major and minor market, speaking many tongues, but sharing a single goal: to control the trade routes between east and west. When Constantinople fell, Venice skillfully slipped into the power vacuums, seized strategic islands, and made themselves the keepers of the ocean's keys. In a world where information travelled by sail, he who controlled the sea controlled the fate of civilizations. Unlike empires that expanded by sword and blood, Venice expanded through contracts, gold, and vision. Rather than conquer, they purchased trade rights, leased harbours, or placed agents at key transshipment points. Spices from India, bolts of silk from China, bars of silver from Germany. Each passed through Venetian hands before reaching Europe. This empire did not conquer by blood, but by intellect and a cold patience. Beneath that glittering surface lay a system that operated with the precision of a clock. From the arsenal, the vast shipyard that could launch a new vessel each day, to the registry of each sailor and merchant, everything was tightly controlled. No one could freely embark without belonging to the Republic's structure. That is why Venice could keep thousands of ships active at once without descending into chaos. The Venetians also invented early systems of insurance and credit that allowed merchants to share risk at sea. A voyage from Venice to Alexandria might last months, yet with a single certificate, someone back home could buy, sell, even borrow money based on cargo still at sea. Because of this, Venice became Europe's first financial centre, where currency and trust were minted together like two faces of the same coin. What set this maritime empire apart above all was the Venetians' unique view of the sea. To them, the sea was not an enemy or merely a trial. It was a mirror reflecting the soul. They believed that by understanding the sea, one could understand destiny itself. From small boats, they learned to read the wind, chart the stars, and feel the breath of the water. Each voyage was a dialogue between humankind and nature, between courage and humility. Venetian merchants traveling far carried not only merchandise but culture and stories. Wherever they set foot, Venice left traces in architecture, laws, and customs that blended East and West. It is said there was hardly a place untouched by Venetian spirit, for each merchant was diplomat, storyteller, and emblem of a creed, freedom and prosperity through commerce. Yet that glory came at a price. Returning ships did not always carry spices or silk. Sometimes they brought corpses, sometimes disease, sometimes war. But for the Venetians, death at sea was an honourable death, for they believed the soul would dissolve into the waves and become part of the city. Venice did not fear losing people, for they knew each wave held a memory. Each drop of water remembered the name of a sailor. Thus, among great powers, Venice remained an exception. A small city, without a mighty army or vast lands, yet able to steer the fate of Europe for centuries. All because of the sea, their lover, friend and teacher. The sea taught Venice flexibility, how to avoid storms rather than confront them. It taught them the art of surviving in a changing world. And that is why Venice was not merely a maritime empire, but a philosophy of life, a place where humanity and nature fused to create glory. Today, when gondolas have become tourist emblems, few remember that from such humble wooden boats, Venice once commanded the Mediterranean. But if you listen closely, in the sound of waves striking the walls, you can hear the whispers of the past, distant voices of those who sailed, who glimpsed the red horizon of power, and then vanished into the mist. That is Venice, the great maritime empire, the network of pearls upon the sea that time cannot erase, a city born of mud, raised among the waves, and forever living in human memory, proof that sometimes the most enduring power does not lie on land, but where wind and water are one. While the ships of Venice tirelessly wove their vast web of trade across the Mediterranean, one son of the city chose a different path, not merely to trade, but to understand the world. When most Venetian merchants looked no farther than Egypt or Constantinople, he went 10 times beyond, crossing deserts, climbing mountains, and stepping straight into legend. His name was Marco Polo, the symbol of a spirit of exploration that Venice had nurtured deep within its very blood. Marco Polo was not the first explorer from Venice, but he was the one who made the world turn its gaze toward the east. Born in 1254 into a wealthy merchant family, Marco grew up surrounded by tales of voyages, of distant lands, where the scent of cinnamon and silk lingered in the sea breeze. For a Venetian child, the sea was the first horizon, and trade was the very breath of life. But for Marco, the sea was more than a route for commerce. It was a door to the unknown. In 1271, at just 17, he set out from Venice with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, beginning a journey that would last nearly 25 years, a voyage beyond anything Europe could imagine at the time. They crossed the Middle East, traversed the Persian plateau, paused in Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, and pushed deep into Asia, through the harsh Gobi Desert, until they reached the capital of the Mongol Empire, the court of Kublai Khan, a place the West knew only through rumor and myth. Marco Polo did more than bring back tales of wealth and wonders. He changed how humanity perceived the world. In an age when maps were mostly blank spaces, and the edges of the earth were marked with monsters, he returned with a treasury of knowledge about China, India, Japan, and lands Europe had never even heard of. His stories of printing, paper money, gunpowder, silk, and the intricate organization of the UN court left even Venice astonished. His book, Il Milione, known in English as The Travels of Marco Polo, became a torch lighting the dawn of the age of exploration. From its pages, explorers like Christopher Columbus, Magellan, and Vasco da Gama drew guidance and inspiration, carrying it as if it were a holy text for their journeys. Through Marco, Venice became not only the heart of commerce, but also a beacon of intellect and ambition that reached toward the horizon. Yet the spirit of discovery was not born by chance in Marco Polo. It was the inheritance of Venice, a city where every canal leads to the sea, and every child grows up with the sound of waves and stories of faraway lands. In the Venetian blood, Adventure and practicality flowed as one. They did not dream foolishly, but neither did they fear risk. Marco was the purest embodiment of that spirit, a merchant turned explorer, a pragmatist turned storyteller of the world. But Marco's journey did more than expand geography. It expanded the map of the human mind. He showed Europe that beyond Christendom lay other radiant civilizations, where people lived with faith, art, and order of their own. He spoke of the grand city of Kanbalik, Beijing, of palaces gilded in gold, of cities more splendid than Rome itself. He described an empire whose laws and administration were so refined that even Western rulers marveled at them. And in every story he told, Venice seemed to glimmer quietly in the background, a city that listened, learned, and adapted. When Marco described how the Chinese used coal for fuel, the Venetians began to think about energy. When he spoke of paper money, Venetian merchants recognized the potential of credit, and when he revealed the Silk Road, Venice swiftly sought to place itself at its crossroads. Every line of the travels was a seed, and Venice was the fertile soil where those seeds took root. Yet when Marco returned home, he was not immediately hailed as a hero. The Venetians were practical people. They doubted tales that sounded too wondrous to believe, but time proved him true. As other merchants confirmed his accounts, Marco became a living legend. Venice took pride in him, the man who carried its name beyond the Adriatic, engraving it into the memory of humankind. The truth is, Venice did not only produce Marco Polo, it needed men like him to preserve its very identity. A city that lives by the sea cannot survive without daring to voyage beyond sight, and a trading empire cannot thrive without curiosity. Marco Polo proved that knowledge itself is a form of power, a power that allowed Venice to rule without swords. Today, as travelers wander through Venice's narrow streets, few realize that it was here a young boy once stood on the Rialto Bridge, gazing toward the sea and dreaming of distant lands. That gaze changed history. It opened not only the Silk Road, but also the pathway between humanity and its own longing, the yearning to reach what lies beyond the known, to overcome fear, and to find one's truest self. Marco Polo was not only an explorer of Venice, he was an explorer of mankind. And perhaps, through him, the world came to understand that Venice was more than a city on the sea. It was a living soul in motion, a Venice that never stops moving, never stops seeking, never stops telling what it has seen, reminding us that every glory begins with a single step taken away from the familiar shore. That is the legacy Marco Polo left behind, not only in written pages, but in the heartbeat of Venice through the centuries that followed. A city that gave him life, and through him became immortal, not just as an empire of trade, but as a symbol of humanity's eternal spirit of exploration, the force that forever drives us forward. When the tales of Marco Polo still echoed through the minds of the Venetians, like a song of intellect and the yearning to journey beyond the horizon, another battle was quietly taking shape at home. It was no longer an adventure across deserts or a voyage to the distant east, but a life-and-death struggle upon the sea itself, where honor, commerce, and power intertwined like furious waves crashing against the hulls of ships. If Marco Polo embodied the spirit of discovery, then the victory over Genoa became the symbol of endurance, of a Venice that knew how to fight to protect its maritime dream. In the 14th century, the Mediterranean was a vast chessboard, where two mighty forces vied for every wind and every current, Venice and Genoa. Both were cities of merchants. Both had built their glory upon the sea, and both believed the sea belonged to them. But while Venice was the child of strategy, patient as the ebb and flow of tides, Genoa was bold and reckless. Sharp as a blade, both knew that only one could reign as the queen of the Mediterranean. The spark that ignited one of the greatest naval confrontations of the Middle Ages was the War of Chioggia, 1378-1321, a prolonged, brutal, and haunting conflict that Venetians later called the Trial of the Soul. Genoa allied with Padua and Hungary, besieging Venice by land and sea, leaving the city an isolated island surrounded by hostility. At one point, it seemed everything was lost. Genoa captured the port of Chioggia, only a single step away from striking at the city's very heart. But it was in that moment of despair that Venice was reborn, just as it had once risen from the mud. Citizens, nobles, merchants, even women and children came together. Those with money gave money. Those with hands gave labour. The arsenal roared day and night, hammers striking metal in rhythm with whispered prayers. Doge Andrea Contarini, though past 70, personally boarded a ship to lead his people into battle. A city of commerce, once thought to know only trade, had transformed itself into a fortress at sea. And then, amid the fury of the Adriatic, Venice struck back. Admiral Vetta Pisani, once imprisoned for failure, was reinstated and redeemed his honour with a glorious victory. The siege of Chioggia was reversed. Genoa, which had come to destroy Venice, now found itself trapped. When the last Genoese sails were lowered in surrender, the people of Venice wept, not only for triumph, but because they knew their city had been saved once more. That victory was not merely a triumph of arms, but of will, of faith that a small city amid the sea could outlast any empire. From that moment, Venice became the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, controlling nearly every trade route, from Constantinople to Alexandria, from Cyprus to Crete. Genoa endured, but its light dimmed, leaving Venice to shine all the brighter. What made Venice remarkable was that even in war, it still thought like a merchant. Each victory was not about conquering land, but securing trade routes and long-term prosperity. After Chioggia, Venice swiftly restored its network of commerce, ensuring that spices, silk, and gold continued to flow into the city. They refused to let victory become mere pride. Instead, they turned it into the foundation of a lasting empire. And here lies the heart of Venice's uniqueness. Where other European kingdoms celebrated victory by building castles or statues, Venice built warehouses and harbours. They did not glorify war, they glorified its results: stability, prosperity, and life itself. In every stone of St. Mark's Square, in every silent canal, one can still sense the breath of a people who learned to win with reason, not with blood. The victory over Genoa also transformed how Venice saw itself. No longer a mere city on water, it had become a true empire, with the strongest navy, the wealthiest merchants, and the most stable government in Europe. The Republic of Venice stood as a symbol of ingenuity, a nation without a king, yet powerful, without land, yet enduring. And yet, amid all its glory, Venice never forgot the lesson of Chioggia, that every victory has its cost. Thousands had fallen, trade had been disrupted, and the wounds within its people took decades to heal. Perhaps that is why Venice, even in triumph, remained humble. It did not grow arrogant or expand recklessly. It fortified itself, like a great ship lowering its sails before a storm. In the years that followed, Venice's culture blossomed more than ever. With trade secure, art flourished. National pride expressed itself through painting, music, and architecture, all carrying the same quiet message: we survived. We are Venice. The composers, painters, and architects who came after inherited that flame. The flame of pride, resilience and grace in the face of crisis. Today, when one stands upon the docks of Chioggia and gazes toward the horizon, it is easy to imagine the hundreds of sails that once filled the wind. No cannon fire remains. Only the whisper of waves, retelling the story of a Venice that once fought to exist, refusing to let the sea swallow its dream. The victory over Genoa was more than a golden page in history. It was Venice's declaration to the world that true power lies not in the sword, but in the ability to adapt, to unite, and to remain steadfast in purpose. Genoa fought to dominate the sea, Venice fought to live with it, and that difference is why history chose Venice as the victor. If Marco Polo was the face of exploration, then Chioggia was the heart of survival, two halves of the same Venetian soul. A city that could dream, yet also knew when to fight. a people who could listen to the wind, yet knew when to raise their sails against the storm. Thus, after the 14th century, Venice was no longer merely a city of merchants. It had become the queen of the Mediterranean, sovereign of the waves, and in the crimson glow of the Adriatic sunset, one can still hear the faint echo of that ancient triumph, when an entire nation, from merchant to monk, from noble to commoner, rose together to defend the one thing they cherished most: the freedom of a city adrift upon the sea. After the glorious victories at sea, when Venice had made the entire Mediterranean bow before the might of its fleet and the intellect of its merchant warriors, many believed this city would forever remain the queen of the waters. But no, as if realizing that an empire can only stand firm when its feet are rooted deep in the earth, Venice began to turn its gaze toward the land, toward Italy, where fertile plains and towering mountains beckoned, and thus a new chapter in the grand symphony of the Venetian Republic began. The mainland empire, the Stato da Terra. If the sea was the lifeblood of Venice, then the land was the shield that protected its heart from enemy blows. The Stato da Terra was not merely an administrative concept, but a symbol of political foresight, strategic clarity, and the yearning for endurance. At a time when European powers were locked in endless conquest, when Italy was still a patchwork of fragile city-states, Venice, born of mud and salt water, boldly advanced inland, accepting the trials of war, diplomacy, and dominion. By the 14th century, the threat from the mainland had grown clear. Powers like Milan, Verona, and Padua eyed Venice day and night. If Venice looked only to the sea, its rear would remain a fatal weakness. Thus, the city's patrician merchants made a pivotal decision: to conquer land in order to secure the sea. Quietly, their campaigns spread like waves against a shore. Treviso, then Padua, Verona, Vicenza. One by one, these cities fell under Venetian influence, not through brutal slaughter, but through subtle strategy and the fine art of diplomacy. The mainland empire was born not solely from sword and spear, but from a deep understanding of power itself, that true power lies not only in trade or naval might, but in control of food, roads, and supply lines. Venice understood that to rule the sea, one must also command the flow of goods from land to port. Thus, the Stato da Terra was not merely territorial expansion. It was the vital system that sustained the lifeblood of the Maritime Empire. Upon these new lands, Venice did not rule through fear, but through order and law. Cities once seen as foes became partners. Infrastructure, bridges, roads, aqueducts rose with the precision of Swiss clockwork. Venice's refined system of governance, honed upon the sea, was carried onto land, blending iron discipline with the gentle pragmatism of merchants. They did not simply conquer, they connected, weaving the land into a living network. More importantly, the Stato da Terra stands as proof of Venice's rare strategic genius. While other kingdoms fell into cycles of war and religious strife, Venice built a balance between land and sea, between commerce and arms. That adaptability allowed the Republic to survive even the bloodiest political storms of the Middle Ages. It was no coincidence that Europeans would later call Venice the nation that walks upon water, yet whose heart beats on land. From this duality, the Venetian identity deepened. No longer were they isolated islanders. They became the first Italians to embrace the vision of connection, a world where land and sea were not opposites, but complements. In every fortress wall and every square of the mainland, one could still sense the breath of the sea. In stone columns carved with waves, in coats of arms bearing the winged lion of St. Mark. Yet the Stato da Terra was not only a glorious chapter, it was also a quiet warning about the complexity of power. As Venice pushed deeper inland, it drew closer to conflict with northern forces, particularly Milan and the Holy Roman Empire. Each victory carried within it the seed of exhaustion, as the Republic was forced to divide its strength between two fronts, land and sea. And yet, within that tension, Venice revealed its astonishing resilience. It did not retreat, it adapted. The Republic forged treaties, arranged marriages, built schools and churches across its new territories. Venetianizing each inch of soil it claimed. The locals, rather than being oppressed, gradually integrated into the Venetian system, where all values converged upon order, law, and commerce. It was this subtlety that made Venice a rare model of rule through persuasion, not coercion. Intriguingly, by the 15th century, artists, architects, and scholars from the Stato da Terra began to pour into Venice, bringing with them the brilliance of the Renaissance. The city once famed for merchants and sailors now became a cultural capital of Europe. Without the Stato da Terra, Venice might have remained an isolated trading island, never the radiant cradle of art and humanism it became. And when twilight settles upon the fields of Lombardy, when the bells of churches echo through the canals of Padua and Verona, one begins to understand the mainland empire was not merely an extension of Venice. It was her second soul, a soul that endures, binds, and always finds its way back to the sea. For to Venice, every road, through mud, through war, through glory, ultimately leads back to where it all began, to the deep, blue waters, where the heart of the Republic still beats softly, in rhythm with the tides. From the fertile fields of the Stato da Terra, where the Venetian Empire had deeply rooted itself in the soil of Italy, a new kind of energy began to rise. No longer merely the power of politics or trade, but the soft strength of culture, art, and knowledge. When ships laden with silk, spices, and gold from the east docked along the Grand Canal, they carried with them not only wealth, but also ideas, inspiration, and the seeds of creativity. And from this moment on, Venice entered the most resplendent chapter of its history, an age when beauty became an instrument of power, and art became the mirror reflecting the soul of the entire empire. Venice, by its nature a nation without a king or queen, understood early on that true power could not rest solely upon a throne. It must be built upon faith, order, and image. Thus, while other nations built palaces to glorify individual rulers, Venice chose to honor the collective spirit through art and architecture. Every wall, every dome, every fresco in the city carried within it a subtle political message. We are different. We are Venice. The leaders of the Republic, the Council of Ten, the Senate, and especially the Doges, were not merely politicians. They were directors of the nation's image. They knew that no empire could rule forever by the sword alone. It must rule through the hearts and minds of its people. And so, Venice turned art into a kind of secular religion, where every building, festival, and ceremony was staged like a grand performance. The audience, none other than the people and the watching world. Look upon St. Mark's Square, the heart of Venice. No tyrant stands immortalized there, no monuments celebrate individual victories. Instead, we find St. Mark, the symbol of faith and unity. The golden lion with its radiant eyes is not just a religious emblem, it is a reminder that all glory belongs to the Republic, and no one stands above the collective. This is the essence of Venice, a freedom within control, an art guided by reason. Yet behind the splendor of its paintings and cathedrals, Venice always harbored a darker side, a system of refined, almost invisible control. The Council of Ten, the highest authority, governed not only politics, but thought itself. They understood that in a society where beauty could intoxicate the senses, the freedom of thought could just as easily breed chaos. And so, Venice maintained a strict system of surveillance, where every word, song, and play was listened to, analyzed, and sometimes adjusted. But paradoxically, that very control did not stifle art. It refined it. Artists, bound within carefully drawn lines, learned to speak through allegory, through symbols, through light and form. They mastered the art of conveying meaning without speaking it aloud. And thus was born a uniquely Venetian style, proud yet melancholic, radiant yet profound, expressive yet never ostentatious. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as Europe was torn apart by religious wars and reformations, Venice preserved an exquisite balance between faith and reason. The works of Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese were not mere aesthetic marvels. They were declarations of a neutral, self-assured empire. Venice aligned with neither Rome nor Luther. It stood between them, using art to affirm that beauty could transcend all dogma. During that same golden age, music, theatre, and festivals flourished. The grand masquerades, the Baroque melodies drifting over the canals. These were not mere entertainments. They were tools through which Venice maintained social harmony through emotion. People could wear masks, forget their status for a while. Yet beneath the disguise, they still followed the unspoken law of the city. Freedom within order, passion within discipline. Perhaps that is why Venice became the cradle of a unique form of liberty, not the unruly freedom of ancient Athens, nor the radical liberty of Enlightenment Paris, but a measured, harmonious, and deeply aesthetic kind of freedom. In Venice, even creativity had its order. Indeed, Venice understood that control need not mean oppression. They governed to sustain the harmony of a vast symphony, where thousands of instruments, thousands of souls, played in perfect unison. Each artist was a note, each building a deep chord, and the government, the conductor, ensuring that no sound fell out of rhythm. And it was precisely this harmony that allowed Venice, though kingless, to stand firm for nearly a millennium, a feat few nations in history could ever claim. One could say that Venetian culture was not a mere garment of power, it was power itself. Art and politics were not opposites, they were two faces of the same coin. Every fresco, every canvas, every celebration whispered the same truth. Venice endured not through military might, but through the strength of its image, a force that made the world bow in admiration without a single arrow loosed. Yet behind all this brilliance lingered a haunting question. Can beauty truly be controlled forever? For beauty, by its nature, yearns for freedom. And from that very perfection, Venice began to edge toward the fragile boundary between glory and decline. For when art becomes a servant of power, it risks losing its soul, its spontaneity, its boundless creativity. And yet, in that moment, amid the golden gleam of paintings, the music echoing through canals, and the gentle lapping of water against stone, Venice remained the symbol of a civilization that knew how to balance reason and emotion, discipline and freedom. Here, every structure, every melody, every brushstroke tells not only of a golden age, but of a philosophy of life, that beauty, when nurtured through order, can outlast even the mightiest of political powers. And so, as the sunset falls upon the crimson rooftops of the city, one can almost hear a whisper from the past. Venice never needed to conquer the world with swords. With art and grace alone, it already did. And then, as every symphony, no matter how harmonious, must eventually reach its final note, the golden glow of Venice began to fade into the mist of time. The perfect harmony that the Republic had so carefully nurtured, in art and order, in commerce and pride, now faced an adversary it could not control, the changing world. As new sails cut across the waves toward the west, as the map of the world was redrawn, the mighty maritime empire of Europe slowly realized that its glory had been left behind by the march of history. This was the sorrowful refrain of Venice, a great empire bearing witness to its own decline. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as the world entered the age of exploration, the seas, once Venice's private stage, grew too vast for a small city built upon a lagoon to command. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and English merchants discovered new routes to the east. They no longer needed the Mediterranean, no longer needed to pass through Venice, no longer needed to pay tribute to the ships flying the golden-winged lion. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, it was more than a geographical triumph. It was a death sentence for Venice's trade monopoly. The empire that had grown rich from the spice and silk of Asia was abruptly pushed off the board. The streams of cinnamon, pepper, and incense that once flowed through the Grand Canal now turned toward Lisbon and Antwerp. And while Venice still sat proudly upon the Adriatic, clinging to its past, the rest of the world had already embarked on a new voyage, one that would give birth to true oceanic empires. Yet the fall of Venice did not come with a thunderous crash. It was a slow, silent, and dignified fading. The city did not collapse from war or invasion, but from the very model that had once made it strong, its insularity, its conservatism, its unshakable faith in the old order. While the world was learning to reinvent itself, Venice clung to its ancient rituals and laws, believing that preservation alone could guarantee eternity. In the marble halls, the Venetian nobles still debated, still donned their crimson robes, still performed the ancient marriage of the sea ceremony as their ancestors had. But beneath the golden reflections of sunset upon the water, one could sense a quiet weariness creeping in. The empire that once commanded the tides was now but a shadow of itself, beautiful, proud, yet heartbreakingly still. The rise of the Ottoman Empire tightened the noose around Venice's neck. After the defeat at Lepanto and a series of bloody Eastern wars, Venice began losing its strategic ports, Crete, Cyprus, and eventually its freedom to navigate the Aegean. The jewels in its string of pearls across the sea fell one by one, and as the Ottomans advanced, Venice, too weak to fight, bought peace with gold, hoping to save what remained of its realm. But those very sacks of gold drained its treasury, leaving the Republic increasingly hollow, sustained only by the memory of its former grandeur. The 16th century also brought a profound spiritual transformation to Europe. The Renaissance flourished, the Reformation erupted, and the scientific revolution dawned. New ideas, new values swept across the continent, and Venice, with its closed aristocratic government, grew old in a world that was being reborn. Once the symbol of freedom, creativity, and commerce, Venice now found its centuries-old stability becoming the very chains that bound it from change. It was during this time that Venice transformed itself into a kingdom of art and pleasure. As trade waned, it poured its wealth and soul into the intangible: music, painting, theatre, and endless celebration. Gondolas no longer carried cargo, but dreamers, musicians, poets, and lovers. The city began to live on memory and emotion, turning itself into an eternal performance, where beauty masked sorrow and laughter echoed through decline. Yet even in its fading years, Venice shone in its own magnificent way. Like a candle burning brightest before it goes out, the city turned its own death into a final act of splendor. The palaces along the canals remained lavishly adorned, the masquerades still glittered with life, and Vivaldi's music filled the air as if Venice wished to tell the world, "If we must die, we will die in glory." And indeed, no empire in history ever perished so beautifully. But beneath that glittering surface, the cracks deepened. The population dwindled, the economy stagnated, noble families fell into ruin, while a new industrial world rose in northern Europe. The proud Venetian ships, once the symbols of speed and dominion, now seemed slow and outdated beside the warships of Holland and England. The Grand Canal still gleamed with lights, yet beneath that shimmer lay waters growing still and shallow, reflecting a city gazing at its own reflection in the mirror of the past. And perhaps Venice's greatest tragedy was this: it did not fall because of its enemies, but because of its solitude. The world changed, yet Venice remained the same, like an old man watching the centuries pass him by. Once the gateway to the world, it became a relic the world no longer needed. As the merchants of the north learned to chart their own courses, and young nations rose with technology and gunpowder, Venice, with its rituals, its music, its ancient ceremonies, became a living museum, where the past still whispered, but the future had closed its doors. Yet, if one looks deeper, Venice's decline was not merely an end, it was a transformation. The city did not vanish, it changed roles in the grand play of history. From a mercantile empire, Venice became a symbol of beauty, of memory, of endurance. As other empires rose and fell, Venice remained, not on the map of power, but in the heart of humanity. For Venice understood something timeless, that beyond trade and war lie art, emotion, and the human soul. And it is these that ensured that Venice, though fallen, would never be forgotten. In the gentle murmur of water between ancient walls, in the sunset glowing over the Rialto Bridge, one can still sense a living Venice, not the empire of the seas, but the empire of memory. Venice lost the race for power, yet triumphed in the eternal game of beauty. And perhaps that is why, more than 5 centuries later, as the world marches on through an age of machines and concrete, people still come here, not to see a tourist city, but to listen to the whisper of an empire that died, yet never stopped dreaming. From the fading glow of its golden age, Venice still tried to hold on to its light, with pride, with festivals, and with the echoing chime of the Campanile's bells, as if the past still had the strength to stir the present. Yet history, in its quiet cruelty, moves on. When the new tides of the world began to rise, every old glory was forced to face its final trial. And there, amid the shifting winds of 18th century Europe, Venice, the brightest jewel of the sea, bowed before a conqueror who came from the land, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a sorrowful moment remembered in history as the fall of the Republic of St. Mark, the year 1797. After more than a millennium as an independent power, Venice stood face to face with the storm called the French Revolution, and with its proud son, Napoleon. An empire once built on commerce, neutrality, and delicate diplomacy could no longer escape the ruthless political currents sweeping across Europe. As Napoleon advanced through northern Italy, Venice, once the arbiter among empires, became merely a fragile piece on the chessboard of greater powers. The tragedy of Venice was not written in blood-soaked battlefields, but in the suffocating stillness of negotiations. When French troops seized Verona and nearby territories, the Venetian Senate still naively believed, neutrality will protect us, as it always has through the centuries. But the age had changed. Neutrality was no longer a shield. It had become a pretext for the strong to devour the weak. And so, in May 1797, after a chain of threats and assaults, Venice was forced to surrender. That day, the golden banner of St. Mark, the sacred lion that had fluttered in the sea breeze for 1100 years, was lowered. The church bells rang, not for celebration, but as a requiem for a great republic. Citizens stood on the Rialto Bridge, watching in silence as French troops marched into St. Mark's Square. No resistance, no volley of honor, only the heavy stillness of grief as people understood that an era had ended. To much of Europe, Napoleon was a symbol of renewal and revolution. To Venice, he was the storm that toppled a marble palace built by centuries of labor and grace. In just a few months, the Venetian Republic vanished from the map. Her once rich dominions, Dalmatia, Istria, terra firma, were divided and bartered between France and Austria, like goods exchanged in a market. Venice, the pride of the Adriatic, became a mere footnote in the Treaty of Campo Formio. Yet even in tragedy, there was a quiet beauty, the kind found in ancient dramas. Venice did not die in disgrace, but in dignity, as one who had lived too long amidst her own splendor and pride. For over 1,000 years, no sword had conquered her. She fell only when the world itself had changed, when the very values that once brought her glory no longer fit the new order. It is said that when the French approached, many noble families cast their bronze lions into the sea, unwilling to let the symbol of St. Mark be defiled. Meanwhile, artists and scholars, instead of fleeing, continued to paint, to write, as if art itself were a final act of defiance. In those twilight years, Venice still glowed strangely bright. The paintings of Canaletto and Guardi preserved the image of a city that never truly died, only drifted gently into slumber. And indeed, Venice did not die. After Napoleon's fall, she became a province of the Austrian Empire, then a part of the Kingdom of Italy, yet her soul endured, lingering in every canal, every dome, every sail gliding through the morning mist. The spirit of trade, of freedom, of proud defiance against the sea still burned quietly beneath the surface. If we look closely, Venice's end is more than the fall of a nation. It is a reminder of the eternal law of empires. No power lasts forever, and no light remains unchanging when the dawn of a new world rises. Venice was once the center of the world, until that world shifted. From the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from sails to steam, from merchants to industrial empires. What makes Venice immortal is not power, but legacy. The legacy of human courage, the will to build upon water, to believe that amid the chaos of nature and history, beauty can still be made. And it is that beauty which keeps Venice alive, long after her nation has vanished, as a symbol not only of Italy, but of humanity itself. Today, when we walk along her silent canals and hear the gentle dip of an oar upon the water, we can still feel the heartbeat of a republic at rest, asleep, but never gone. For though Venice fell beneath Napoleon's boots, she lives on in memory, in art, and in the dream of humankind. Because sometimes, what is eternal does not lie in victory, but in how one accepts defeat, with grace, with beauty, and with the calm of a city that knows, even buried beneath the dust of time, her soul will drift forever, with the sea, into infinity. And then, after the final sails were lowered, after the last bell tolled its farewell to the Republic through the mist of salt and sorrow, Venice fell into a long slumber, but it was not death. It was transformation, a quiet rebirth in another form. For there are empires that live by land and power, and when they lose them, they vanish forever. Yet there are also empires that live by spirit and culture, and they endure, not on the map of politics, but in the hearts of humankind. Venice belongs to the latter. Though the Republic of Venice has been gone for more than 2 centuries, the name La Serenissima, the most serene city, still resonates across the world. The worn walls, the moss-covered roofs, the slow canals drifting beneath the arches of the Rialto Bridge, all seem to whisper a story with no end. Venice is no longer a centre of commerce, yet it has become the centre of memory, of art, of beauty, a beauty that rises above the reach of time. For if the power of old Venice was once measured in gold, fleets and ports, then her legacy today is the soul of humanity. A treasure no conquest can claim, no force can steal. When you stand in St. Mark's Square, you do not merely see architecture, you hear the murmurs of centuries. Every stone, every mosaic, carries the spirit of a people who once believed that man could build eternity out of the most fragile element of all, water. Nice is proof of the power of imagination. Nowhere else in the world do art and life intertwine so completely. For centuries, this city has been a muse, inspiring painters, poets and musicians, Titian, Tintoretto, Canaletto, Vivaldi, Byron, Wagner. Each of them found in Venice a reflection of their own soul, melancholy beneath splendor, vanity laced with solitude, and an aching desire to reach for beauty, knowing it would fade. The music of Vivaldi's 4 Seasons feels like the city's own heartbeat. Spring, lively as the sound of oars breaking dawn's still water. Summer, heavy and golden, shimmering upon the lagoon. Autumn, solemn, like wind threading through narrow alleys. Winter, cold and damp, yet warm with memory. Venice lives in each note, in every dreamy brushstroke, in the pages of every wanderer who came, fell in love and never truly left. And then, in a beautiful paradox, the death of Venice made her immortal. When she ceased to be a political power, she became a symbol of elegance, of fragile beauty, of cultural endurance beyond time. Each year, millions arrive not merely to see canals or palaces, but to feel that strange atmosphere, where past and present blend, where one can lose themselves in a maze of stone, water, and light. For Venice is not merely a place, it is a feeling. It is the hush of a gondola gliding past half-drowned houses, the song of the gondolier echoing through fog and moonlight. It is the moment you stand upon the bridge of sighs, hearing the wind whisper through marble gaps, realizing that everything most beautiful in life is also the most fragile. And perhaps that is the deepest philosophy Venice offers to the world. Venice is also a mirror, reflecting the struggle of the modern soul, torn between material and spiritual, between technology and art, between power and beauty. In a world ever more restless, Venice reminds us, prosperity means little if it does not nourish the soul. Though the city sinks inch by inch each year, it still stands, not by engineering, but by the reverence humanity holds for it. Many say that Venice is dying, that the sea is rising, that one day the city will be swallowed whole. But perhaps they are mistaken. For Venice has died many times before, to war, to plague, to decline, and yet she has always returned, reborn through the things that cannot be destroyed, memory, music, art, and the longing for beauty. Venice does not fear the sea, for she was born of it. Her immortal legacy does not dwell in crumbling walls, but in the idea she plants within the human heart. The belief that though we are small and finite, we can still create eternity through our hands, our souls, and our faith in beauty. Every traveller who leaves Venice carries a fragment of her spirit, and wherever they go, whenever they hear the lap of water or the toll of a distant bell, or see light shimmer upon a surface, they remember her. One might say that Venice has departed from history as an empire, but remains within humanity as a poem without words, sung only through light, water, and time. And that is the essence of her eternal legacy. When a civilization no longer exists through power, but endures through feeling, through memory, through the very breath of the world, even now, as night falls upon St. Mark's Square, when a violin plays softly in the sea breeze, it feels as if the old spirits return. Merchants, artists, dreamers who once lived and loved this city with all their hearts. They are still there, mingling with the lapping water, the salt in the air, the moonlight on the red roofs. For Venice has never truly left the world. She has merely transformed into a symbol of eternal beauty, one that neither time nor war nor mankind can erase. Venice, the jewel of the sea, the city of dreams, the soul of beauty, may drift upon the water, but she will never sink into oblivion, for to love Venice is to love life itself, to love art, and to believe in humanity's wondrous power to turn the fleeting into the everlasting.